Hey creeps! As some of you know, when I travel, one of my favorite things to do is to visit a local fabric store. By doing this, I'm able to support local business, typically find fabrics that I adore, and prints that I've never seen before. During my husband and my trip to Astoria, I went to a shop called Homespun Quilts and Yarn where I found the most adorable Halloween prints in 1-yard bundles, and it got me thinking how cool it would be to demonstrate the power of 1 yard of fabric by making a bunch of different projects using 1 yard or less of material. We'll be making a sewing machine cover, an ironing board cover, a book sleeve, and an unlined tote with these fabric finds. But let's go back in time to our trip in Astoria before we partake in the sewing marathon, shall we? Welcome to the channel, the place to come for spooky DIY home and lifestyle content all year long. Let's go fabric shopping in Astoria. The drive from Portland to Astoria is about 2 hours, so totally doable in a day if you needed to go back and forth. Astoria has been one of the primary filming locations for a handful of movies, including The Goonies and The Ring 2, and sits near the mouth of the Columbia River where it meets the Pacific Ocean, which, because of the currents and the uneven river bottom, has proven to be a treacherous area to navigate for sailors, causing more than 330 shipwrecks, earning itself the name the Graveyard of the Pacific. We made sure to stop by some of the touristy must-see spots by visiting the outside of the Liberty Theater, the Flavel House Museum, the Oregonville Museum, and took tours of the Columbia River Time and Heritage Museums. This quirky and quaint city has such a rich and extensive history. Originally occupied by the Chinookan peoples, Astoria is recognized as the first permanent American settlement west of the Rocky Mountains and became part of the United States with the Oregon Treaty in 1846. Once having a monopoly in the fur trade and an economy centered on fishing, fish processing, and lumber in the mid-1900s, today you can find art galleries, microbreweries, and a plethora of antique shops along the main drag and craftsman-style housing perched upon hilly suburb streets. This first fabric from the Spooky Night collection caught my eye immediately and is by Grace Pop. These remaining fabrics are by various designers at the Ruby Star Society and part of the Small Frights collection. For Christmas, my husband gifted me a new sewing machine that came with this cheap cover, which I plan to take apart to be used as a pattern for my new sewing machine cover. Luckily, this process was super simple. First removing the hem, then removing the serged seams at the sides and boxed corners. Before taking my cover apart, I made sure to put it on the machine just to see if I should be making any adjustments. I found that it was kind of long, so I simply removed an inch off the hem on both sides. Zinnia was being especially cute today, helping me lay out the fabric and pin my pattern. To preserve as much of the width as possible, I cut only the fray, but not that fray, off the salvage, leaving the designer name and print collection title to get sewn into my cover. I laid the old cover on top of the material to see if I could sneak the shell and liner across the width of the material. I found that it was probably half an inch shy, but since it was loose around the machine, the lack of that width wasn't going to hurt. As for the sides of the cover, I had the edges of the pattern extend 1/4 of an inch past each side, then transferred the handle hole and one of the boxed corner cutouts with a pen. I then folded the cover material in half lengthwise and using my pen lines cut out both boxed corner cutouts. Once finished, I unfolded my cover and cut out the handle hole through both layers. Using the strip I cut for the handle, I traced this onto the remnant and then measured 2 inches all the way around the perimeter. I wanted my cover to be a little padded, so I decided to include some single-sided fusible fleece, which I cut using my shell as a pattern. For the handle facing, I used a medium-weight single-sided fusible interfacing to reinforce this piece. I also want to point out my exceptional rotary cutting skills. Cutting behind the stabilizing hand is not for the faint of heart. Before jumping into sewing, I fused my interfacing pieces to their corresponding pieces.
Are you happy?
The first steps were to sew the side seams and then the box corners on both the liner and the shell before sewing them together. I did this with a 3/8 seam allowance. Once done with these steps, I sewed all the way around my hem, placing my shell and liner right sides together, making sure to match up my side seams. This might be overkill for some, but I decided to do understitching to keep my liner edge from extending past my shell edge before doing my top stitching around the hem. You can do understitching too by folding both sides of your seam allowance towards the liner side of the seam, then sewing 1/8 of an inch from the original seam on the liner. After flipping my cover right side out, I sewed my top stitching 1 inch from the hem edge. To make my life a little easier when attaching my handle facing, I first sewed all my cover layers together around the handle opening, about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. In preparation for attaching the facing to the cover, I first finished the facing's edges by folding each edge 3/8 of an inch and then sewing the folds in place with a seam 1/4 inch from the edge. I could then attach my facing to the handle hole. To do this, I laid the right side of my facing against the right side of my shell, lining up all the edges and pinning them together, and sewing all the way around the perimeter with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Clipping little triangles from the corners allows for easy turning. With some persistent finger pressing, I was able to pin the facing to the inside of the cover and then sew yet again around the handle opening 1/4 inch from the edge to keep the facing in its place. For my book sleeve, I took some measurements from a couple of what I would consider standard paperback size books of mine and used these measurements to come up with a plan for how big to cut my book sleeve pieces. After running a few sums and figures, I determined that my shell pieces should measure 7 1/4 by 10 3/4, and my liner pieces should measure 7 1/4 by 9 3/4. JK, I later find out that I cut my shell pieces too short to fold into the inside of the sleeve to make an inch facing. To avoid having to cut more pieces to then sew more seams, you can instead cut your shell to be 2 pieces at 7 1/4 by 11 3/4. These measurements will be down in the video description. With the right sides together, I sewed the top edges of the shell and the liner together with a 1/4 inch seam. Then after some thread color changes, I did some understitching to keep the seam clean and crisp, then stitched in the ditch for my top stitching that will appear an inch from the top edge of the sleeve. With both sleeve halves assembled, I put them right sides together and then sewed a 1/4 inch around the sides and bottom. Because I can't help myself and I love a finished seam allowance, I got the serger out and sewed an overlock stitch on the sides and bottom. To give my sleeve a little dimension, I decided to make box corners at the bottom, matching up my side and bottom seams and staggering my seam allowance to reduce bulk. My plan for the ironing board cover was to remove the current cover from the board and take out the string, cinching the cover around the board to be used for the new cover. Once the current cover was flattened, I could then use it as a perfect makeshift pattern. Zinnia was being very helpful as per usual during the pinning and cutting process, deciding that watching was boring and to do some pinning of her own. I loved how this fabric collection had this orange contrasting selvage and didn't opt for the traditional white one that everyone seems to go with. After getting my piece cut, I used extra wide double fold pre-made bias tape to create my drawstring casing. To do this, I unfolded my bias tape and stitched along the fold on the wrong side of my ironing board cover, then folded my bias tape around the raw edge and edge stitched the bias on the right side of the cover. Once the casing was complete, I took a safety pin and attached it to one end of my drawstring and manually threaded it through the casing. Then it was just a matter of placing the cover back on the ironing board and cinching it so that it was taut, eliminating any wrinkles or looseness. After raiding my trim stash, I found that I had a couple webbing options for my tote handle. I ultimately decided to go with the ivory option and began cutting my tote pieces. I wanted most of the tote to be my favorite print with the skulls and tombstones, so I cut 2 pieces to be 18 3/4 by 15 3/4. For the contrasting band at the top, I cut 2 pieces of both my cotton and medium weight single-sided fusible interfacing, measuring 18 3/4 by 6 3/4. Since I had no idea how long to make my handle, I used one of my fave totes from Sprout for reference and cut both handles at 26 inches. For my contrasting handle bands, I cut 2 pieces measuring 6 1/2 by 2 1/4. Before jumping into sewing, I completed my preliminary pressing steps, fusing my interfacing to my contrast band and folding over the short ends of my handle bands. To make my handle bands, I first edge stitched the short ends, then did a hand base stitch to keep the band's long edges folded to the inside of the handle, then folded the webbing in half the length of the contrast band and edge stitched the webbing edges together. Getting into tote assembly, I first sewed my contrast bands together at the short ends with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Since my tote is unlined, I wanted to make the inside as beautiful as the outside by doing French seams. This technique requires a few more steps. First, placing your fabric layers wrong sides together, sewing the side seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, pressing these seams open, then trimming the seams sides to be 1/8 of an inch, to then fold the seams back the other direction to conceal the seam edges. The process is then finished by sewing another 1/4 inch seam, encasing the seam's raw edges. To sew up the bottom seam, I repeated the previously outlined steps before moving into the boxed corners. To make my boxed corners, I folded my tote, matching up the side and bottom seams, making sure to stagger the seam bulk by folding these seams in opposite directions. I then marked out my seam edge line in pen, measuring out to be 3.5 in length. I repeated the French seam steps, even for the corners. The handles were placed 2.5 inches from the center and roughly 4 3/4 from the side seams. After seeing how the handles were going to hang, I decided to sew them along the webbing edges and across the webbing 1 inch from the tote top to reinforce them. With the handles attached, I sewed the contrast band to the rest of the tote with a 3/8 seam allowance, and then finished this raw seam with some extra wide double fold pre-made bias tape. I hope you were able to pick up some tips and tricks with these tutorials and maybe even see how accessible sewing can be without a pattern. I'm going to be dropping my video output for the next 3-ish months, so instead of putting out a video every 2 weeks, I'm going to be putting out a video every 3 weeks. I'm doing this while I work on some extra projects, but then I'll be back to my regular posting schedule come the Halloween season, so don't worry. I also want to take a moment to say that if you do have a local fabric or art and craft supplier, to go spend your money with them. I will admit that I spend a fair amount of money at these corporate big box craft retailers because of the convenience and the numerous discounts that they offer, but I also know that part of the reason why they're able to offer these discounts is because of the diminished quality and in some cases the questionable manufacturing and sourcing practices that they have. For these reasons, I'm trying to be a more educated and mindful consumer and purchase when I can from small businesses. If you happen to be in Astoria, Oregon, make sure to visit Homespun Quilts and Yarn. And if you aren't subscribed, please consider doing so to get all the Creepy Craft content on your homepage. And thank you, as always, for visiting my Creepy Craft corner of the internet and for watching till the end. Now let's see those final shots.